When building guitars, you always end up with a bunch of extra wood that you sit there and say, well, I can't use it for the guitar, so what am I going to use it for? And usually, I'll make pins or something out of it. I'll put the little pieces of fancy wood on the lathe, make a pin out of it, give it to somebody. But in this case, I was talking to my brother, and he was telling me about my niece and nephew, who are fairly young, and they play a lot of chess, and they've recently gone to state and did really well. My niece, who's only in the first grade, I think, came in 10th or something in state or something like that. So I said, well, I'll make them a chessboard. And I have a bunch of things like ebony I couldn't use that are just too thin, or the white streaks in it just can't really use too much. Pieces like this, right? I have tons of this type of stuff. So what I did is I was going to use this for a Strat, but it's actually too thin. So what I did is I took these pieces and I gave them a rough resaw on the bandsaw, and I got these things pretty thin. I don't need them to be real thick for the top of the chessboard, but I'm going to need 4 pieces that are at least 18 inches. And you can't really stick these through a planer when they're this thin, because most planers stop right around 1/8 of an inch. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a scrap piece of MDF that I have, and I'm going to use double stick tape. I'm going to put these guys on here, and I'm going to run them through the planer to get them all to the same height. As soon as I'm done with that, I'm going to be grabbing some bird's eye maple pieces that are also too thin for me to do anything with, and I'm going to do the exact same thing. I'm going to run these through the planer and get these guys to the height that they need to be. One thing about bird's eye maple and planers, or flamed maple and planers, they don't get along, right? They have a tendency to do chip out and stuff like that. Now there's ways that you can overcome that. Usually it's better to send these through a drum sander, but I think I'm going to be okay. One way that you can do it is you put a thin coat of water on it, and when you put this through the planer, you put it at a slight angle, right? So that way it's kind of going this direction against the grain instead of going with or against the grain. And by doing that, it kind of helps a little bit. Also, you do it in increments of like a 64th of an inch, things like that. That will help. It'll take a lot longer, but when you do it, you end up getting a better result. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to stick some double stick tape on the backs of these guys, clean them up because it won't stick if there's dust on it, And I'm going to run these through the planer. Okay, so now we have a bunch of pieces that are really close to being about a 1/16 of an inch. They're pretty close to what to each other. They're pretty close to the thickness of each other. So I'm going to call this good. This is practically a veneer now, and I just have to make sure I don't break it, because stuff is so thin that this double stick tape is so good. It's like the last thing I want to do is break it or anything like that. But we've got some pretty thin stuff here that will work just fine. So I went ahead and I ran these through the bandsaw to cut them all to about the same width, really close to it. So when I run them through the planer as a group, kind of like this, I know that everything is even and everything would be nice and pretty. I also ended up finding some oak that I can't really use for anything, so I might be able to use this also for the chessboard. And I also found some walnut, right? This is cool. I got some walnut too that I can't really use for much of anything, so I might be able to use this for the chessboard as well. Just different woods just to make things pop. So now I'm going to take this, I'm going to run it through the planer, and I'm going to get each one of these edges perfectly flat. So when I end up gluing these guys together, It's a nice tight seal. Okay, so what I did is I took some of that walnut and I planed it on two sides, and then I just ran it through and I cut it about that thick. Doesn't matter what the top or bottom looks like, because at the end of this it's all going to get sanded and everything anyway, right? But these two sides that are plain have to be flat, because if not, it's not going to have a nice tight fit against these pieces of wood. Some people will ask, Will, why is it when you do these things you never show you using the tools? Simply because of all the goddamn YouTube safety Nazis. They irritate the living shit out of me, and best way to avoid it is make sure that they don't see what you're doing, right? These are the type of people that they could watch a live birth and sit there and bitch the mom out for not wearing safety glasses during it, and bitch the father out for not wearing ear protection. They just need to shut the fuck up and go home. You know, I won't allow anybody to tell me how to use my tools. I've been in this game for way too long, and I don't take kindly to that shit. People from the peanut gallery, as they say. Okay, so the way that I'm going to end up doing this is I'm going to basically be doing it in this way, where I've got my walnut strip, and then after the walnut strip I'm going to put a piece of ebony, maple, you know, walnut, maple, walnut, then ebony again. And I'm going to do this throughout the whole thing. I'm going to glue them all together and try to get them as close as I can get them. Okay, so I have a piece of MDF here. This is what I'm going to be using for the base of my board here. And I've drawn a line, and I made sure it was square with one side, because after I'm done with this I'm going to end up cutting this out on a table saw in the size I need. Now, I could do that now, but the reason why I'm not going to is basically because, where is this at? I'm going to grab these pieces of oak, and these pieces of oak I'm going to be creating basically like a carpenter square out of it that I can clamp to this board right here, and that way one side I can have tight against this, and I can also clamp the other side like this, making sure that this is perfectly square. Well, I don't know if you can see that, hang on. Okay, right here like this, making sure that this is perfectly square, so when I start putting my pieces in here, everything is what we would call awesome. And then as soon as I know that this is square, I'm going to clamp this piece down. And I need this side to be clamped down quite well, just so, because I'm going to end up wedging these guys to make sure there's a really, really tight connection between all of these pieces. Put some glue down. And let me get a brush. You don't need a lot of glue. I've mentioned it before in my other videos about how too much glue is just as bad as too little glue. You just need enough for the stuff to grab decently. And then from here we'll put a piece of ebony. And this walnut will want to kind of pop up a little bit, right? Because it's not going to be perfectly flat. So you've got to make sure that when you start pushing these guys next to it, it's actually next to it and not under it. You could put a little bit of glue in between these guys, but the reality is these things are so thin. I'm going to put it like this. These guys are so thin that if you ended up doing that, it wouldn't really serve too much of a purpose. This is pretty much like a veneer. It'd be like trying to glue pieces of veneer together. and I keep pushing these things down. So I'm going to continue doing this all the way down, and after I get to the end, I'll show you how I'm going to do a wedge clamp to kind of push these guys over. And it's important that when you do that wedge clamp, you don't do it too tight, because it'll cause these guys to buckle because it's so thin. So I have the last piece here, and I've been, like I said, I've been pushing these guys down, making sure everything's lined up nice and pretty. And now I need to really put pressure this way on it. So I've got another piece of oak, and what I'm going to do now, there's actually going to end up being some of these pieces that I'm going to have to go through and push down again because they're kind of popping up a little bit. But that's just because it's so thin that the glue has actually caused it to swell a little. I'm going to clamp this down, but when I clamp it, I'm going to put it at a slight angle like this, so I can put a wedge in here and hammer the wedge in, and it's going to force all that stuff this way. So yeah, I'm just going to be using a scrap piece of lumber that I found over there by the bandsaw as my wedge, and I'll hammer that in. And then that's going to give it some nice tight force this direction. Okay, so I went ahead and I put it inside the vacuum press, and this will make sure that the bowing that was happening, the little cupping, because these guys are so thin, the glue was kind of causing it to cup. It'll make sure that these guys stay perfectly flat. It'll force all of these like little pieces of walnut down. I'll leave it in here for about an hour, and then from there it should be dry enough that I can take this out. Okay, so what I did is I took this out. I took the belt sander to the tops of these pieces of walnut, and I sprayed the top of this with water, and this is what you're seeing down here, okay? But I saturated the top of this with water, and now I'm putting it back under pressure. Now the reason why I'm doing that is I want this wood to swell, and by this wood swelling, what it's going to end up doing is it's going to fill up a lot of these little gaps, right? And when this, I'm going to wait for about an hour or so. As soon as it doesn't look like it's really that wet anymore is when I'm going to go ahead and take the vacuum off of this. But by doing this, like I was saying, what it's going to do is it's going to cause this stuff to swell both up and out and everything. Okay, so it is out of the vacuum press, and I cut down the side where originally we had that line where I put that piece of oak. And after I cut down that, I went ahead and I ran it down the joiner a couple times just to make sure that this is perfectly flat. So now that I've got this perfectly flat, I'm going to measure over the distance of one of these slats, and I'm going to end up running this through a fenced bandsaw, and I'm going to be cutting these out in strips. I'm going to go slightly more so I can run it over the joiner again, and after I run it over the joiner, I'll have a perfectly flat side on both sides all the way down, and then I can start adding more of the walnut strips in between these, so that way everything matches up and it looks right. Okay, so I've got some more of my pieces of walnut. I've got these guys all cut, and I sent them through the joiner. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to flip them just like this, each one, and in between each one I'm going to be placing another piece of walnut just like this. Now I'm doing this in small increments, and I'm using clamps to put all this stuff together. I'm putting a piece on top, and I'm breaking off two pieces of the thin to sit on the bottom to keep this at an equal distance, because there will be a gap there. But when I glue the finished board on top of another piece of MDF, it'll take care of that, and I won't have to worry about it being a weak spot. Okay, so what I have done is After everything was put together, I put 2 clamps on the outside just to kind of keep everything together, because the glue was still just a little bit tacky, which is exactly what I was looking for. And I took a random orbital sander with 80 grit while the glue was still up here, still a little tacky, and I ran it over the entire board to knock down not only the walnut, but with the glue still being a little tacky, anywhere that there was a small gap or anything like that, what it does is it kind of acts as a wood filler, and it fills up these gaps. So now this is really, really tight. All of these seams are very tight. And anywhere that there was a slight gap, it's gone now because of the glue and the sawdust. What I'm going to do now is take these clamps off, take this once again to the bandsaw, cut as straight as I can down both sides, run it through the joiner, and then as soon as I run it through the joiner, I will be back and I will show you what the next step is. So what I've done is I've taken the piece of MDF I'm using as the base, and I've marked the center on each one, and then I've taken a square and I've made my lines. Because I have these pieces of walnut in between these, even if I didn't, I could use the seam as my center line, because we have 4 and 4, it's dead center. So what I do is I line each one of these up on all sides like this, and then I'm going to draw a line all the way around this guy so I know where to put the glue. Now when I lift this up, I have a perfect square. Everything will be lined up. Now if you don't have a vacuum press, it doesn't mean you can't do this. You just have to clamp it really well all the way around using a very large piece of wood or metal that's unforgiving. So that way you have something on the bottom, something on top, and you clamp it down and it won't go anywhere. For me, this is just a lot quicker and easier. So in about an hour's time, I should be able to take this out of the vacuum bag and just kind of continue moving with this thing. It's moving right along. It's doing okay. Okay, so I took it out, took a razor to the side of it, and scraped off the glue that's next to the edge. And razors are a great tool. I've got some of this 1/4 inch mahogany that I was talking about, and I've already put a 45 on one end, and I'm going to line this up with the edge of this, okay, and I've got actually 2 pieces of this ready to roll, right, and on the other end I'm going to mark exactly where I need to cut the other 45, right. There's no reason to measure with a measuring tape when you can do it this way. Okay, so I went ahead and I put some glue on these and have them clamped down, and everything's good and tight. German Virgin und good and tight. And so from here I'm going to give about 30 minutes to let it set up. Just in case you're wondering how I'm clamping those last 2 pieces of walnut in, I went ahead and I put the glue on one side, obviously on each side. Then I took a piece of the African mahogany that I'm going to be using actually for the sides here, cut them a little larger, put them here so that way these clamps have something to grab a hold of, and then just basically clamping them like that. The reason why I have these small clamps here is to prevent this from tipping, right? Because I can't get a really good grab on these, and the direction of force is going to want these guys to kind of go up like that. So I've changed my mind about staining this first and then putting it up against there. I'm going to go ahead and actually put these things, install them now, and I'll just be super careful about staining these guys. Now this has some small gaps here and there down the side of this, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to take some grain filler that's sandable and stainable, and I'm going to go ahead and kind of push it in here and smear it all over this area, and everywhere that there's also a seam. That seems fine, this seems fine, but these two guys kind of separate a little bit over here, and I'm going to put that stuff inside there, and as soon as that dries, I'll take the 220 to it. Well, I figured since I was rubbing this in with my finger and getting it around the outside, there was a couple of small spots on the board too. I thought, I might as well put some of the grain filler, wood filler in there. And this stuff dries pretty light, and luckily for me, everything was on the maple side. So what I'm doing before I do anything here to the outside, I kind of want to protect the top of this because I've sanded it and everything's ready to roll. I also kind of want to know what it's going to look like. I want to give it a nice mellow tone. So I'm using natural stain, right? And I'm only doing this on the top. And this is also cleaning up a lot of the ebony dust that is inside a lot of the nooks and crannies and got smeared over the maple. And just like all stain, after you put a good coat on, you let it sit for a minute. Then you take a dry rag and you wipe up the excess. So it's morning time, and I've turned it over, and I'm going to be using a template bit for this. This bearing will be riding down the side of the MDF, and it will trim off the mahogany piece that's right here, so everything is perfectly flat all the way on all sides. Well, I found some more mahogany scrap, so I'm going to end up, I ended up cutting it to the thickness of the chessboard on the base part, and I'm going to end up gluing this and nailing this on as well. And I'm not going to end up putting an edge on it until it's actually on here. And after I get all of these on, I'm actually going to put clamps on it to kind of suck this this wood in a little bit more, because the pin nailer isn't really strong enough to act as a clamp. So while I have this kind of setting up with the thing clamped, this is the bit I'm going to use for the edge. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to ride this a little high, and so this will actually end up being the top groove, top roundover on the very, very edge. This will never be touched by anything. So it's basically only going to be this little detail right here that's going to show up on the side. And because I'm going to be doing this from the top, what I have to do, because the way that the router base is, now I mean I could just run this over with the routing table. I could just do that, or I could have done the detail before I glued these pieces on. I just didn't feel like doing that. So what I'm going to end up doing to make sure that the router doesn't tilt is the height of, let me see, okay, the height of this board I have scrap wood left over that's the same height as this. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to end up just kind of laying that basically close to the edge here. Not on the edge, but you know, about right here, just to give it a little bit of support, and I can run the router down and it won't shift. Okay, so now what I need to do is I'm going to go through with my sandpaper, and I'm going to hit all of these little areas that really need it. So, there's little things like where a little bit of the wood filler kind of came in here, and you can use a razor to scrape up a lot of stuff. Any extra little glue here and there, because I'm getting ready to stain this guy now. But I also want to round over all the edges, like I mentioned before. Rounding over the edges is important, because if not, it can cause splintering. When I do painting and staining like this, I always use frog tape. That's the brand of it. I don't use blue painter's tape. Frog tape leaves a better finished line, and the paint and or the stain doesn't want to penetrate underneath it as much. When you use standard painter's tape, you'll get it'll go underneath the texture of it. Right? It'll look like crap. Okay, now I'm just going to use paper towels to apply this, and it will leave a little bit of fuzzy things here and there, but before I clear it, I always end up running it over with a tack cloth anyway, so any of these little fuzzy things, it'll pop up. Nothing will be left behind. And as mentioned before, you end up just kind of drowning the wood and just let it absorb. Don't sit there and just keep rubbing it in, just let it absorb. And you'll see that when you wipe it up, it'll have a nice even coat. When it comes closer to the tape up here, I'm not going to be just putting a big glob of this stuff on, simply because I don't want it to get underneath the tape. So now I'm going to let this stuff set on here for a little while, and then right when it looks like it's almost dry is when I'm going to start wiping it up, because I want this to be a very, very dark mahogany color. Okay, so now what I'm going to do is it's been sitting on here for a little bit. I'm going to start wiping it up. And, you know, what's going to absorb is what's going to absorb. You know, you can't force it. It's just, it is what it is, you know. And leaving a little extra in the grooves, you can do that to accentuate them, which a lot of people do. Or you can you know, try to take it up just like I did right there. As mentioned before, one of my favorite tools is a simple razor. I can get this and drag it right down the edge of this walnut, and anything that was on there from the tape will just come right up, and it'll have a nice even clean edge. So where I accidentally sanded through the veneer, that doesn't look good to me at all. So I've made the decision that I'm going to take my airbrush, and the outside of this I'm going to antique. And basically the way that I'm going to do that, it's just basically going to be a fade in with black, right? So I'm going to do airbrushing with black, and I'm kind of fade it in, and then I'm going to end up taking some red candy, fading that in, and also a little bit of yellow, and have it just kind of cruise on over into this and antique it a little bit, and it should hide the sanding error that I did here. Wish me luck. Sorry about that, guys, the battery died. But you can see the way that I kind of antiqued this, it took care of that situation that I was dealing with down there pretty damn well. So from here, what I'm going to do, just so you know, basically when you're doing something like this, it's just like any other burst. You know, I did my black, and then afterwards I did my candy red, and then I did a candy gold. And the candies are transparent, right? So you can kind of build color upon color, and that's how I ended up doing that. Now, this by itself right now looks pretty cool to me, but it's really gonna jump out as soon as I put the clear on. So here it is, guys. It's not too shabby at all, right? Not too bad, made out of just scrap material. I'll probably hit it with clear a couple more times just to fill up the grain, and then do a wet sand and buff just so it looks like glass that's on top of it. But this by itself I think looks pretty nice. I think it turned out well. Anyway, guys, until next time, I will talk to you later.